Instead, we have the opportunity to make a habit of empathy, to recognize ourselves in each other.
Following is audio from Obama's book, Audacity of Hope. And in it he starts talking about his friend Senator Paul Simon, who he feels was a very empathetic person. And he also starts talking about how he learned empathy from his mother.
But people also sensed that he lived out his values, that he was honest, and that he stood up for what he believed. And perhaps most of all, that he cared about them and what they were going through. That last aspect of Paul's character, a sense of empathy, is one that I find myself appreciating more and more as I get older. It is at the heart of my moral code, and it is how I understand the golden rule, not simply as a call to sympathy or charity, but as something more demanding, a call to stand in somebody else's shoes and see through their eyes. Like most of my values, I learned about empathy from my mother. She disdained any kind of cruelty or thoughtlessness or abuse of power, whether it expressed itself in the form of racial prejudice or bullying on the schoolyard or workers being underpaid. Whenever she saw even a hint of such behavior in me, she would look me square in the eyes and ask, "How do you think that would make you feel?" But it was in my relationship with my grandfather that I think I first internalized the full meaning of empathy. Because my mother's work took her overseas, I often lived with my grandparents during my high school years, and without a father present in the house, my grandfather bore the brunt of much of my adolescent rebellion. He himself was not always easy to get along with. He was at once warm-hearted and quick to anger, and in part because his career had not been particularly successful, his feelings could also be easily bruised. By the time I was 16, we were arguing all the time, usually about me failing to abide by what I considered to be an endless series of petty and arbitrary rules, filling up the gas tank whenever I borrowed his car, say, or making sure that I rinsed out the milk carton before I put it in the garbage. With a certain talent for rhetoric, as well as an absolute certainty about the merits of my own views, I found that I could generally win these arguments, in the narrow sense of leaving my grandfather flustered, angry, and sounding unreasonable. But at some point, perhaps in my senior year, such victories started to feel less satisfying. I started to think about the struggles and disappointments he had seen in his life. I started to appreciate his need to feel respected in his own home. I realized that abiding by his rules would cost me little, but to him it would mean a lot. I recognized that sometimes he really did have a point, and that in insisting on getting my own way all the time, without regard to his feelings or needs, I was in some way diminishing myself. There's nothing extraordinary about such an awakening, of course. In one form or another, it is what we all must go through if we are to grow up. And yet I find myself returning again and again to that simple principle. How would that make you feel? As a guidepost for my politics. It's not a question we ask ourselves enough, I think. As a country, we seem to be suffering from an empathy deficit. We wouldn't tolerate schools that don't teach, that are chronically underfunded and understaffed and underinspired, if we thought that the children in them were like our children. It's hard to imagine the CEO of a company giving himself a multi-million-dollar bonus while cutting health care coverage for his workers, if he thought they were in some sense his equal. And it's safe to assume that those in power would think longer and harder about launching a war if they envisioned their own sons and daughters in harm's way. I believe a stronger sense of empathy would tilt the balance of our current politics in favor of those people who are struggling in this society. After all, if they are like us, then their struggles are our own. If we fail to help, we diminish ourselves. But that does not mean that those who are struggling, or those of us who claim to speak for those who are struggling, are thereby freed from trying to understand the perspectives of those who are better off. Black leaders need to appreciate the legitimate fears that may cause some whites to resist affirmative action. Union representatives can't afford not to understand the competitive pressures their employers may be under. I am obligated to try to see the world through George Bush's eyes, no matter how much I may disagree with him. That's what empathy does. It calls us all to task, the conservative and the liberal, the powerful and the powerless, the oppressed and the oppressor. We are all shaken out of our complacency. We are all forced beyond our limited vision. No one is exempt from the call to find common ground.
In times of great challenge in our country and around the world, Americans have always come together to lend a hand and to serve others and to do what's right. That's what the American people have been doing in recent days with their extraordinary generosity and contributions to the Haitian people. See the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.